Hi everyone, I'm Laura Eastlake and welcome to the final event in our EHU19 virtual speaker series. For more events and news on all things 19th century, including details of our new MA programme in 19th century studies, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at EHU19 or check out our website on the Edge Hill University web pages. But for now, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Eleanor Dobson is lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of Birmingham, where her work focuses on the reception of ancient Egypt in the 19th and 20th centuries. More broadly, she is interested in the materiality and history of the book, as well as notions of the supernatural and the occult, and those cultural spaces where science and the supernatural seem to overlap. She has published on literature, culture and Egyptology, on Oscar Wilde and Victorian photography, on mummies and fairy tales, and tonight she's here to talk to us about performing Egyptian magic. So don't forget you can join Ellie for a live Q&A on Wednesday the 10th of March at 6 p.m, but for now I am delighted to introduce her to talk about Egyptian magic.
Hello everyone, my name is Ellie. Today we are going to be thinking about Egyptian magic as it was performed and as it was written about in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what I'm going to do today is run through a little bit of context. So how Egyptian magic appeared on stage, how it was coded as Egyptian, but equally how the kinds of performance magic that were drawing upon Egyptian imagery and kind of coating it in this Egyptian shell, how similar things were taking place in spiritualist seances. And from this point, once we have a bit of background, I want us to turn our attention to some literature and see how we might trace in the fiction of the final decade of the 19th century and the early years of the first decade of the 20th, how we see, I suppose, the modernity of these technological advancements, of the conventions of performance, whether it's supposedly real phenomena taking place and materializing in the seance, or clearly fabricated tricks, conjuring being performed on stage, how we see that manifest in depictions of genuine ancient Egyptian magic in literature. So I'm going to refer to some scholars whose work is really useful, I think, in understanding the most fascinating grey area between stage magic and spiritualism, and those really significant overlaps in terms of what's being produced or performed in each of those worlds. So we will turn first to Peter Lamont, who is a historian of magic, who observes that in the mid-19th century, with the emergence of modern spiritualism, a whole new breed of conjurer appeared who claimed that what she or he did was quite genuine, and in doing so provoked the wrath of those who had been trying so hard to distance themselves from any notion of real magic. What seems clear is that the public distinguished between conjurers of tricks and conjurers of spirits in terms of their respective claims, but tended to associate the methods of the latter with those of the former. I think what's really interesting about what Lamont observes here is that the audience, way Helen, who is a magician and who is a spiritualist medium, is how they frame their performance, what they claim to be able to do. But equally, that audience is that publics are seeing spiritualists and associating them with magicians, associating their methods with the same methods that they might see performed on stage. So a really kind of blurred line between the two, I think. I thought I would give you guys an example of the kinds of Egyptian materializations that were coming through in seances. I'd love to talk more about this if people have questions about it, because I think Egyptian objects and Egyptian spirits and Egyptian spirit guides in seances is super fascinating. But just one example, which may well be my favorite, is the spiritualist medium Elizabeth Desperance in 1890 produces out of nowhere a 7-foot tall lily. You can see it here in the photograph next to her. It's 6 foot when it has that natural curve in its stem, but when it's pulled taut, it's a 7-foot tall plant, which is impressive enough. But what I think is so romantic and captivating about the story behind the lily is that Elizabeth Desperance's spirit guide says that the lily has come from Egypt, and the proof that the lily has come from Egypt is that a piece of mummy bandage is found around the stem. And I don't mean tied around, I mean the stem has kind of grown through the bandage. The bandage is tested. It's claimed to be genuine ancient Egyptian mummy bandage. And so her spirit guide has supposedly brought both the plant and the bandage from Egypt. This is something which is clearly thrilling in a seance setting. It's fantastical, it's romantic. Egypt as a presence, I suppose, adds that sense of mystery, of a kind of genuineness to the magic. I say magic to the materialization. But equally, I think if we kind of cast our minds to stereotypes of performance magic, many of which have their origins in the 19th century, we can very easily conjure up the image of the magician producing from nowhere a bouquet of flowers. And I think Lamont is right here that this the framing of this act of producing flowers is really altering how it's received, how it's understood in terms of realness or fabrication. This is something, this kind of blurred area that Janet Oppenheim has also observed. So Oppenheim points out that for modern audiences, mediums who were supposed to be in touch with spirit agencies might, if caught cheating, prove themselves no different than magicians, whose performances depended only on the right equipment. Not a few professional magicians refused to recognize the possibility of genuine mediumship at all, and insisted that mediums were merely stage performers who offered a highly diverting routine, largely by sleight of hand, assorted conjuring tricks, and a magician's paraphernalia. So for Oppenheim, the difference, I suppose, between the magician and the medium is this the instance perhaps of being caught cheating, of being proven to be using the same techniques, and interestingly the same equipment, the same paraphernalia as people who are claiming to be magicians rather than mediums. And I think this this idea of the paraphernalia of the magical kit is really important, and we'll come back to that later. I wonder though if the spiritualist seance and if the magic performance, I wonder if some audience members encountered them in quite similar ways, and I wonder if we might understand this through a literary conception by a scholar called Michael Saylor, and he's writing about fiction. He's writing about when readers seeking enchantment began to inhabit the imaginary worlds of fantastic fiction for extended periods of time without losing sight of the real world. These readers had recourse to what I call the ironic imagination, a form of double consciousness that became widely participated during the 19th century. The ironic imagination enabled individuals to experience alternative truths. Now, of course, it's utterly true that for many people who are going to spiritualist seances, supposedly, or actually, if the case may be, talking to relatives, talking to the deceased, for many, this is, of course, like deeply significant and an important and religious. But for other people, I think the attendance of seances was a diversion, was entertainment, was quite akin to a magical performance. If we read H. Rider Haggard's memoirs, for instance, he talks about going to some seances as a young man in the hopes of kissing the spirits. He's not taking it seriously, he's taking it as a bit of fun. And I think the ironic imagination is really useful to us as a concept because while we might fall back naturally on things like the suspension of disbelief, I think there is a way in which to believe, to temporarily believe or to entertain simultaneously in the reality of the magical experience as well as its unreality, to kind of be skeptical and also to be enchanted, to allow yourself to conceive it as real, I think might actually be another way in which we might see the seance and stage magic as kind of doing the same thing. So we'll see these overlaps throughout, I think, to suggest a kind of twin influence. And I think as I come onto the Egyptian Hall and we talk a little bit about anti-spiritualists, this fraught and tense relationship between magicians and spiritualists, but equally a relationship by which spiritualists are mimicking the techniques how magicians are demonstrating supposedly the phenomena produced by spiritualists, and that there's a kind of cat and mouse, I suppose, going on there. So as we continue, one of the things that crops up, which I find really interesting, if you look into publications on magic as genuine supernatural power, but equally magic as conjuring performance, as sleight of hand, as trickery, is that quite often, if you turn to these publications in the 19th century, they will open with, or have very early on, a kind of allusion to ancient Egypt as the birthplace of magic, regardless of what kind of magic they're talking about. So, for instance, if we open up Paul Christian's Histoire de la Magie, History of Magic, we get a rather lovely frontispiece of the goddess Isis sitting on a sphinx. He's writing histories according to the caption. We see pyramids, we see behind her pylon temples, we see ruins, we see ibises, we see a fanged serpent that's ready to bite something. And we also see astronomical equipment, we see telescopes, we see geometrical equipment, I think is also included there. So in this conception of magic and Isis as writing down her mysteries as the kind of original magician, in this volume at least, we have this conflation of the magical and the scientific. And I think what's really interesting to ancient Egyptian conceptions of magic is that to the ancient Egyptians, magic, medicine, and science were all one and the same. There was no distinction between those categories. And I think that's really interesting and useful when we come to understand 19th century magic in seances and in on stage, but also in visual culture more broadly, as being really technologically based. It's very much indebted to science and kind of developments in optics and the illusion. So this isn't just something that we see in books about proper, actual, real magic, but we also see it in books about conjuring. So a couple of examples. We have the Boy's Own Conjuring book, obviously for children, to teach them how to do parlor magic. We have this early reference to antiquity. So the author notes that sleight of hand, tricks of the tongue by which the word was kept to the ear but broken to the hope, and various miraculous deceptions were the means by which the priests of Egypt, Greece, and Rome used to subjugate mankind. So in the Boy's Own Conjuring book, instead of being the birthplace of real magic, ancient Egypt is a place in which the priests are using their deception, their sleight of hand, their technologies, their illusions to control the uneducated, the unenlightened population. So magic is a kind of sham here. And of course, the boys who are doing the conjuring inherit this tradition of tricking people from the ancient world, from Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Looking at a chunkier book, which is definitely for adults rather than children, this is Albert A. Hopkins's fantastic magic. It's really chunky. You can find digitizations of it online. The introduction is written by Henry Ridgely Evans, and the very first line in this whole volume is far back into the shadowy past, before the building of the pyramids, magic was a reputed art in Egypt, for Egypt was the cradle of magic. And Evans goes on to cite lots of biblical passages in which Egypt is associated with, I suppose, the most superior magical powers, until, of course, folks like Moses come along and do it better. But I think it's really interesting that all of these works that bring magic really up to date and chart the histories of magic, they almost invariably have Egypt as the birthplace of magic, whether that's supernatural, real power, or whether it's trickery and conjuring of tricks. And equally, I think through volumes such as Hopkins's magic, we see how the tropes of antiquity, how the imagery of antiquity is used as a way to, I suppose, eyes the modernity of some of the trickery, to suggest its antiquity, to suggest its realism, in a way that if things were obviously modern, they wouldn't feel infused with that almost orientalist seductiveness, the mysteriousness, the mystique of the tricks. So as much about how they are packaged as what the trick actually is. Now, this building on the left is massively important, I think, to the kind of culture that we're illuminating. This is the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly. This was built in 1812, and it was originally designed to be an exhibition hall. So they had loads of exhibitions. There was art, there was Napoleonic artifacts, there were also Egyptian artifacts at some point, but it wasn't designed exclusively to hold Egyptian stuff. But it's historically significant as the most, or the prime example, I suppose, of what we might term neo-pharaonic architecture. So architecture which is done out explicitly to look like ancient Egyptian architecture. Of course, it doesn't look really Egyptian, but you know, it's not a bad attempt for 1812. This is pre the decipherment of hieroglyphs. And we do get some kind of typical Egyptian features here. We see, although the building is straight up and down, we do see that pylon shape being suggested by some of the decorative facade. We see the suggestion of those like nice temple-y pylon shapes. We see winged sun discs. We see sphinxes. We see Isis and Osiris looking pretty Greek there, I suppose, in style, but still the suggestion of ancient Egyptian deities on the front of the building. Now, this is until 1905, when it was sadly demolished. It is the most significant architectural example of neo-pharaonic architecture, but it is also, from the 1870s onwards, the most famous magic venue, if not in London, then if not in England, rather than certainly in London. And you might be able to make out from this photo on the right, we have Mr. Maskelyne's sensational magical romance, The Philosopher's Stone, daily at 3 and 8. And we also have above the front entrance improved animated photographs, the finest in London. Animated photographs are the earliest moving pictures. So not only is this a magic venue, a famous magic venue, but equally it is a place of technological innovation. It's where we see the first moving pictures being shown in the city, which dates this photograph to the late 1890s. I don't think the actual date is known, but certainly we have in one building a representation of something extremely old, of the most antique architectural structures that you might find represented in London buildings, but also the most cutting edge technological innovations. And I think that collision between antiquity and modernity and the coding of the most cutting edge technological developments in this kind of ancient cloak to suggest, as well as its modernity, that it is something old, that it is something familiar, is one of the most fascinating, almost paradoxes of this culture. You can see here on the right as well, one of the programs from 1887. You can see here the two magicians who made the Egyptian Hall famous, Messrs. Maskelyne and Cook from England's Home of Mystery, the Egyptian Hall in London. And I think what the Egyptian Hall does, which later cinema venues, often in the 1920s, in the 1910s, in the 1930s, draw upon this Egyptian aesthetic and make themselves out to be almost tomb-like spaces where films are projected into the dark. We get, even before that with Maskelyne and Cook, a sense from the program that this is a temple and there are secrets within. We have the glowing light of mystery. We have snakes hissing as we enter the temple. We have beautiful bare-bosomed ladies holding braziers to welcome us in to see these horrors or delights, whatever is in store for us in the Egyptian Hall. So certainly, and even though Maskelyne and Cook are famous anti-spiritualists, i.e. they're demonstrating how spiritualists are producing particular effects in the seance room and saying, this is nonsense, don't believe them, we can do it too. We're not going to tell you the way we do it, but if we can do it, we can prove that it's fabricated. From the program, you don't get a sense of that. You don't get a sense that what's inside is going to be debunking. You get a sense that what's inside is going to be genuine mystery. And I think the ironic imagination, as Saylor terms it, is really important to understanding the debunking, but also still maintaining the titillation and the thrill of the magical performance. So occasionally the magical performances inside were Egyptian in theme. And I thought I'd mention one of the most popular illusions to be performed in the Egyptian hall. And this was the Sphinx. You might also hear it called the decapitated head, which is literally what it looks like. And this was an illusion performed by a man called Stoddert. And Stoddert's Sphinx, you can see him with his Sphinx on the left. Stoddert is the well-dressed magician, and his Sphinx is a mysterious, supposedly decapitated head who, when Stoddert commands, opens his eyes and answers the audience's questions in quite cryptic ways. Very exciting, one might imagine, and an incredibly popular act that kept Stoddert going for quite some time without needing to be tweaked or altered. So it really was very popular. You can see there on the right, I'm not sure how clearly you'll be able to make that out, but you may be able to see those little dotted lines that shows that the decapitated Sphinx is actually a man whose head is going through a trapdoor in the table, and he is crouching, concealed behind, I think he's actually on a little stool there. I think it would be uncomfortable to crouch for that period of time, but he's actually concealed behind two mirrors which form an angle. I think you'd have to be very careful about where you set it up, but effectively it gives the illusion that the head is by itself, it's decapitated, and there is no man crouching behind the table. Very simple when you think about it, but also very effective. And I think these kinds of illusions, if you imagine them being performed in the Egyptian hall, where you go through that grand entrance and you sit there and you see a supposed ancient Egyptian entity giving you these cryptic answers to your questions, I think the kind of combination of the architecture and the act really adds an element to how an audience might have felt immersed, which I think helps with that ironic imagination. We're within an Egyptian temple space, and here we have an ancient Egyptian entity speaking to us. I think the layering adds to, I suppose, the believability of this kind of act, and we'll see these effects materializing not just on the stage, but I think interestingly enough in the kinds of ways in which members of the public, tourists, might themselves embrace the imagery of ancient Egypt. And this is going to move us on to some rather amusing images, including the one on the poster for this talk. So a long time ago now, I saw the first of these photos, and I was struck with how fantastically un-Victorian they seem, and also very Victorian at the same time. And I think it's that that stereotype of the Victorians being humorless versus the fact that these are so incredibly funny that makes them funnier still. These photos, you can trace this particular series back to a photographic studio in Cairo. This is a studio called Stromae and Heyman. And what these photos are, it's actually very simple. It's not that magical at all. It's a face in the hole, essentially, that you can like go and do on any kind of pier in this country and just get your face in there and have your photo taken. It's fantastic, though, how remarkable the cardboard models look, how well they're done, and how many people seem to have wanted to take one of these home as a tourist photo. So there's another example there with the same cardboard sarcophagus that a man has shoved his face through in that little gap. The most famous person I found who has done one of these is Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination would spark the First World War. I don't think that's been attributed to the mummy's curse yet, but I can only imagine it's a matter of time before somebody clocks it and starts that rumor going. But what I think is fantastic about these pictures is that they became so popular that not only could you get your picture done like this in Cairo, but there were also photographic studios elsewhere where you could get these done. And not just in the face in the hole type, but you could have a photograph of yourself, have your face superimposed onto a sarcophagus from the comfort of New York City, for instance, without having to go to Egypt at all. The superimposition is really important, I think, not just to the kinds of illusion in these kinds of photos where you don't actually need the physical cutting out. You just have the illusion kind of ready-made for you. But in spirit photographs, we see very similar techniques. And actually, one of the most fantastic examples, and I think one of the most fantastic juxtapositions as well, is in that chunky book Magic that I mentioned earlier. So if we look at Hopkins's Magic, by the time we get to page 436, it really is a chunky book. We get a lovely picture of a very well-dressed gentleman, and kind of appearing behind him slash kind of on top of him almost are what appears to be at least a couple of women who look kind of ancient, maybe ancient Egyptian, going from at least one of their headdresses. There's another face that's coming through a little bit creepier there, which we can't really make out. But what I think is so fantastic in the work that Hopkins is doing, because Hopkins is an anti-spiritualist, is what we see on page 437. And on page 437, we see this painting of an ancient Egyptian woman, the juxtaposition making it very clear how one face has been superimposed onto the other photograph to suggest the presence of a spirit, whereas all that it actually proves is the presence of a painting. So we see here very clearly the kinds of trickery, the kind of effect that looks like a kind of transparent, gauzy spirit, where something's been half exposed, something that's been half added, as opposed to being made physically solid, is impacting upon this picture. And I think these fadings, these appearings and disappearings is one of the most interesting tropes that crops up when we turn to the fiction. Perhaps the most fascinating example of all that I've found, and I haven't been able to trace it properly, is a newspaper clipping from the British Museum archives, which supposedly depicts the British Museum's unlucky mummy, which has been so fantastically illuminated as a case study by Roger Luckhurst. In this image, we can see the ancient Egyptian artifact that the spirit supposedly haunts or is connected to. And on top is this, I don't even think particularly well-clad ancient Egyptian woman who stands here nearly naked, shining through, not very malevolent at all, but quite seductive, which a skeptic would say is the result of a double exposure, or exactly the same kinds of techniques that have produced the spirit photographs that Hopkins is debunking in his book. This is, I think, an imagery produced in an American periodical. So the sources are known. It's the one instance of a double exposure of the unlucky mummy that I've been able to find. But it's presented here in the newspaper as factual. And I think that's really interesting, that these discourses of the real and the unreal are colliding, not just on the stage, not just in the seance room, but also in the periodical press. And that fact and fiction, as you might have heard from my colleague Will Tatterstill in the last talk in this series, you know, in the periodical press, we get that such an interesting blurred line between those two, and what's real and what's unreal is sometimes so indistinct. In this newspaper, we get this this image that so many readers must have looked at and thought, that's not real, but you know what, it's fun to indulge in the ironic imagination and believe, yes, this is a spirit of an ancient Egyptian woman haunting this artifact. So one of the most important people is a man called Georges Melies. And I'm going to show you a few examples of his films. The reason why Georges Melies is so important is not only because he is a pioneer in the film industry, producing some of the most famous early moving pictures that existed, but also that he was enormously influenced by the Egyptian hall. And so we see a direct influence in terms of the imagery of the hall itself, but also in terms of the kinds of illusions that are being produced films. I'm going to attempt now to transition so fluidly into some of these films so that you can see them. Let's make sure that I can get the screen up. So in theory, I've now transferred the screen share to a different window, and I'm going to show you a few films where he has this really clear and strong Egyptian aesthetic. I think it's so fascinating that with the most up-to-date technology that you can have in terms of producing animated images, he is choosing to come back to Egyptian iconography. So assuming that this will load. Okay, I think this should be working. So let's turn the sound off. People always put sound on these silent movies, so let's enjoy them peacefully. I'm going to talk through as these movies go on, because some of them are quite difficult to see. But basically, this one is the Oracle of Delphi from 1903. It starts with a priest, perhaps, opening up a tomb, and a magnificent box is placed within this tomb space. And we can see a rather sinister figure crouching down in the bottom left at this point. I think this is Georges Melies himself as the kind of sinister presence who's waiting for the tomb to be locked. So the priest character, I suppose, leaves with the two maidens who have carried the box to the tomb, and the sinister figure approaches. And we can see he's a baddie because he's got a big knife with him, and he's going to open up those doors with this knife and rob the tomb. So what we see is we see him plunder that lovely box, and he seems to be rather cautious and aware that something bad is about to happen. And lo and behold, in fades a spectral figure. This rather mysterious bearded man becomes ghostly, and then I suppose becomes solid. And Georges Melies, the tomb robber, begs for forgiveness and says, yep, I'm going to return this box to the tomb. It's placed back within, but the sphinxes are about to transform into women who, when they touch him, give him an ass's head. It's slightly Midsummer Night's Dream at the end. They go back to sphinxes, and then the bearded man fades back into a spectral figure, disappearing from view, leaving Georges Melies horrified at his new appearance. That's the first one. These are all slightly comic, but also quite dark. The next one is also from 1903. This is called The Monster. You'll see very similar effects in this film, but these are really fantastically revolutionary for their time. And we start with another Egyptian setting. We see the Sphinx, we see the pyramids, and we have a man here who is a magician in the center. And the man on the right is the prince, and he has brought with him the body of his dead love, who is now a skeleton. And he's brought the skeleton to the magician in the hopes that the magician will revive her back to her former glory. So we will see how this pans out. The skeleton's already moving, which is probably a bad sign. The magician doesn't seem too pleased about it, at least. And we know that some of those stop tricks where the film is stopped and restarted and cut in particular places are coming up, which is very typical of Méliès' style. So the skeleton is covered in sheets. I think we really see the influence of stage magic there. Of course, things are always covered in sheets, and then the magic's about to happen. And of course, here the skeleton becomes a dancing body under the sheets. The prince doesn't seem too happy about this. I don't think this is really what he had in mind, but we do get some fantastic effects where the ghoulish figure seems to melt into the floor and seems to come back up, and the magician seems to be controlling its growing and shrinking. Of course, the head seems to detach there. The funniest part, I think. So the prince is horrified, and he's like, no, this is not what I asked for at all. And the sheet goes on. We know some magic's about to happen. And when the sheet comes off, she is restored to her former glory, the beautiful woman who is so typical of magical performances. The sheet goes on, and alas, she is thrown into the prince's arms, and she returns to her skeletal form. He's got quite a dark sense of humour, Méliès, I think. Now, this is the final clip, and it's much shorter. This is from a film called The Misfortunes of an Explorer. This is a 1900 film. And you'll have a sense of what happens from the still, which I used as the title slide for the talk. So an explorer is going into a tomb, and we know from that still that he is going to encounter animal-headed Egyptian entities down in this tomb, and we know that there's going to be another beautiful ancient Egyptian woman, a goddess / sorceress, who is going to control the magical events that happen here. But all we have left of this mostly lost film are the first 15 seconds or so, where he enters into the tomb, finds a sarcophagus, and thinks it's a good idea to creep inside. And of course, we know from the still, it's not a good idea at all. So what happens after this point is that the ancient Egyptian goddess materializes. We know that she summons those ancient Egyptian entities. We know that he's put back into the sarcophagus, and the sarcophagus is set alight. And we do know that he gets out all right in the end, but probably never to adventure into a tomb again. So perhaps one of the most famous people to have been influenced by the Egyptian hall, its imagery, its magic tricks, and to immortalize some of those on film for us to watch over 100 years later. Those dissolving effects, those transformation effects are ones that I think we will see very clearly coming through in the fiction. Now, before I turn to the fiction, and I promise I am going to get onto it, I thought it was really interesting that modern magical culture and modern magical periodicals are often drawing upon the Sphinx as a particular image of the magical, the genuine magical, but also the kind of trick magical, the conjured magical. And I was struck by a periodical, which is an early 20th century periodical for magicians, called the Sphinx, and how again it replicates that temple, and we're invited to see particular magicians working within the temple itself, very much akin to the facade of the Egyptian hall. And that equally, as a little aside, you can also find this imagery used by this example on the left, the German theosophical publication also called Sphinx. So we do get that used in kind of occult circles, and the Sphinx being drawn upon in similar ways. But I was struck in particular by this edition of the Sphinx, in which we see, which is quite rare for magic in the early 20th century, we see a woman magician called Ionia. And Ionia is a fascinating figure. If you read more about her, she is one of the few very successful, famous women magicians. She is a lady called Clémentine de Vere, and she has a fairly short career, but a really interesting one. And for her performances, she assumes either an ancient Egyptian or an ancient Greek persona. And I was struck by one of her rather lovely posters, which was actually printed in Birmingham, which is a very unexotic link to a very orientalized image. But here we see Ionia, the goddess of mystery, and we see a very Egyptianized performance. And we know that there was, we know from historical sources that there was a lot of costuming, there was a lot of props and scenery that Ionia would use in her performances, and that she had multiple assistants. And we can see some of these assistants in the poster. We see the beautiful female assistant being put into a box that looks very reminiscent of Stodère's Sphinx. Actually, we see the Sphinx face on the box, and we see a table underneath, which is, we should always be suspicious of a table underneath. We know there's going to be mirrors, we know there's going to be a trapdoor, thanks to Stodère. So we almost see the replication of an old trick here, an old trick which is made more theatrical, which is made grander by multiple assistants, by the magician herself being in this faux ancient Egyptian costume, by backdrops and sets beyond just the detached Sphinx head. And again, I think even with all of this Egyptian, all of these Egyptian trappings, we're going to see a similar trick being done here, which is either of disappearance or transformation. And these are the motifs that we're going to see as we turn to the fiction crop up again and again, described in very modern language. Now, I thought I'd start looking at the novels with a very small snippet from H. Rider Haggard's novel Cleopatra. And this is a historical romance, I think would be the best way to describe it, about the famous Egyptian pharaoh Cleopatra, the seventh to be specific. And our main character, our protagonist in this novel, is a magician. And his magic is fantastic, and he experiences all of those mysteries of Isis, those rites of Isis, where he sees glimmering shapes and his voices in the temples, which reads very much like a spiritualist seance. But I was really struck when I read this, and this was years and years and years ago when I first noticed this, and have done very little with it since, and want to do something with it, that we seem to get, even in this quite dense historical novel, and we get a real sense of Haggard's passion for Egyptology, but equally a passion that some people would probably think, okay, you're overdoing it now, let's get over the dry details and get to the juicy stuff. There are these little playful references to modern magic that creep in. And this is our main character, who describes when he's performing these amazing feats that in his hand he held a wand of ebony, tipped with ivory, such as is used by priests and masters of magic. Now, this prompted a little bit of digging into the history of the magic wand, which was a really interesting couple of days of falling down that rabbit hole. But it turns out that the modern magic wand, as we know it, the kind of black magic wand with either one white end or two white ends, is supposedly the work of the early 19th century magician Robert Houdin, who actually is the man whose name inspired Harry Houdini's surname, turning Houdin into Houdini in the late 19th century. So a massively influential magician who supposedly came up with the first black magic wand with a white tip. The magic wand, of course, for stage magic being key to misdirection. We're looking at the wand where actually the magician's doing something elsewhere. So it's drawing our eye to something which is definitely not magical. But in Haggard's novel, this modern magic wand creeps back into an ancient setting. And this is a beautifully illustrated novel, but it's also a novel that has these lovely illuminated capital letters that begin each chapter. And this is much smaller in the real book, of course, but the illuminated capitals, which is designed by an artist called Whymper, they're fantastically detailed, and I was struck by how one of them actually includes this little representation of the modern magic wand, black with the white tip. If you look at the illustrations that actually depict what's happening in the book, you never see the wand, and I think it's because seeing that modern magic wand would be so out of place in an actual illustration that it would spoil the effect. But in the illuminated capital there, we see it kind of tucked away as a little joke, I think. Now, Haggard does something a little bit clever in that his magic wand he describes as of ebony tipped with ivory. And if you look at real ancient Egyptian magic wands, they're not long and thin and straight. They're kind of banana shaped, as you can see in the example here. But there is a little bit of historical accuracy that Haggard injects into his modern magic wand because he notes that it's tipped with ivory. And most examples of magic wands that we know about today are of hippopotamus ivory. So there is that little bit of historical accuracy. And I wondered too, as I looked at these examples, whether Whymper has put something of that curved shape into the illustrated capital and has put something of those wiggly, for lack of a better word, wiggly serpents that we see at the end, at each end of the magic wand into the curved illuminated capital that we do see there. So I wonder if Whymper is also kind of knowingly joking to the real magic wands versus the modern magic wands as the two kind of collide in Haggard's historical fiction. Let's talk about some more literature. This is an instance from E. Nesbit's The Story of the Amulet. So we're talking about a children's novel at this point. And what I love about this is that it's so tongue-in-cheek and it's so meta, and we layer up the real and the faux magical in such a way that it becomes so joking and so knowing. And I'm just imagining the grown-ups who are reading this to their children in 1906, just really enjoying this moment in the novel and thinking, this is for us. So this is 1906. And this moment in the novel, these are children who are traveling through time. They go back to ancient Egypt. They have an amulet from ancient Egypt that allows them to go to these different civilizations. And the children's nurse breaks into the gloomy music of the autumn rain on the window panes by suggesting a visit to the Egyptian Hall, England's home of mystery. So she's actually quoting their advertising material there. All children, as well as a good many grown-ups, love conjuring. Now, this novel is published in 1906, and the Egyptian Hall is demolished in 1905. So when the children go to the Egyptian Hall, they actually find it's not there. But they do go to where Maskelyne and Cook have set up their new premises. I don't think it has to be the Egyptian Hall itself for the Egyptianness of the magic to be really relevant, as I hope you guys will agree when I read the next part of the passage. So they end up there at the new premises in time for the most wonderful magic appearances and disappearances, which they could hardly believe, even with all their knowledge of the larger magic, was not really magic at all. Now there was a vacant seat next to Robert, and it was when all eyes were fixed on the stage that Robert felt someone in that vacant seat. He did not feel someone sit down in it. It was just that one moment there was no one sitting there, and the next moment, suddenly, there was someone. Robert turned. The someone who had suddenly filled that empty place was Rek-Ma-Ra, the priest of Amen. Though the eyes of the audience were fixed on Mr. David Devant, Mr. David Devant's eyes were fixed on the audience, and it happened that his eyes were most particularly fixed on that empty chair, so that he saw quite plainly the sudden appearance from nowhere of the Egyptian priest. Now, Mr. David Devant is a real magician who worked for Maskelyne and Cook. He is one of the most accomplished magicians, according to magic historians, of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So Mr. David Devant, who becomes a character in the story, tethering it to the real world and the real magic of the Egyptian Hall and the new premises that the magicians moved to, says to himself, "A jolly good trick, and worked under my own eyes in my own hall. I'll find out how that's done." He had never seen a trick that he could not do himself if he tried. By this time, a good many eyes in the audience had turned on the clean-shaven, curiously dressed figure of the Egyptian priest. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Devant, rising to the occasion, "this is a trick I have never before performed. The empty seat, third from the end, second row gallery, you will now find occupied by an ancient Egyptian, warranted genuine." He little knew how true his words were. So I think there's a lovely joking collision of the fake magical, the conjured, the illusory with the genuine magic. And I think the way that the children see it as a larger magic versus a smaller magic is really interesting. They don't see it as faked and real. They see them as just the same thing, but on different scales. And the fantastic joke that even Devant, who is one of the best magicians of the time, can't tell that this is real magic and thinks, "I'm going to figure this out," I think shows an added layer of jokingness and playfulness, and also I suppose almost affection for the magical that I think Nesbit is really interested in. She's interested in a kind of magic that almost kind of is seen through the eyes of a child, is seen through the childish imagination, and all of it seems real. A couple more examples. I think in Iris, a mystery by Theo Douglas, which is not often read nowadays, but is a fantastic story. We see some of the apparatus, perhaps, of the magician, but equally something of seance phenomena too. Now, this text, we move on to a new genre. It's subtitled A Mystery, and so we've gone from romance with Haggard through children's fiction through to mystery stories. This is a fascinating story, which is in many ways quite conventional, but in other ways is fairly remarkable. It's one of those stories which has now been published under the author's original name. It's a woman author for the kind of Bailey series, which I know has been quite controversial. But I think it's nice that this story is being more widely read, at least now, because it is one that you don't see referenced too much. And Iris is about an ancient Egyptian woman who I suppose comes back to life in the modern world, and our British narrator falls in love with her. And they get married, but she is pursued by an evil ancient Egyptian priest who is determined to tear her from the arms of her modern lover. And as he removes these pendants from her necklace one by one, you can see the necklace there on the cover, she begins to slowly fade away. And so we get this fading motif again that we see in the films of Melies, that we, I suppose, assume in the Disappearing Woman, which is the staple of the magic theatre, I suppose. Let's get that slide back up. So at this point in the novel, our narrator is looking at Iris, who is sleeping. He recalls her face perfectly as she lay lost in dreams on that hard pillow in the winter dusk. Her right hand was under her cheek as she lay, her left, with the wedding ring on it, hung down in the glow of the fire. I saw both hands plainly, but what was this other? A third hand came into sight over her shoulder, a slender hand, longer and larger than her own, and darker in tint, the lean fingers moving round the collar of her dress, as if to pluck it undone. A hand only in view, but with no appearance of detachment. It seemed to reach over from behind her as if the figure to which it belonged were concealed by the back of the sofa, and the arm passed through it. The hand was quick in movement, and as I started to my feet, it had already dived within the collar. I flung forward upon it, but was too late. The eel-like thing eluded my grasp, withdrew and vanished. Indeed, that I ever touched it, I cannot be sure, but there was Iris awake and looking at me in surprise. Nothing earthly was lurking in the shadow. We were alone in the room. So, this moment in the text, I think, we have a couple of things that should strike us as interesting in light of the context of all manner of magical performances. I think the first thing that struck me as really interesting when I read it was this idea of an arm passing through the sofa, the idea of furniture as having fake backs, as having ways to be manipulated, to be able to pass through, to be able to supposedly move through something solid, to be able, I suppose, as apparatus, as the kind of bulky items that we might associate with physical magic, but also that we might associate with the seance and the idea of the spiritualist cabinet. And I think also equally, we have that idea of the disembodied hand, the spectral hand that he's not sure if he touched, that doesn't seem to be detached, but equally he doesn't seem to be attached to anything either. That withdraws and vanishes seems to be so much the language of the seance here. And I thought I would just turn very briefly to some of the most famous mediums to use a cabinet as part of their experiments or performances, depending on your stance. So these are the Davenport brothers, very famous kind of mid to late-ish 19th century mediums. And here on the left, we can see the cabinet, we can see arms and hands materializing through a small aperture. And on the right, we can see an example of one of their seances where, once again, an emphasis on arms, this time kind of disembodied and floating there, picking up musical instruments, taking off the medium's clothes and untying their bonds. And read Catherine Wynn's book, Bram Stoker, Dracula and the Victorian Gothic Stage, where she talks about, in Bram Stoker's fiction, the disappearing and reappearing lady, for instance. She does a really interesting analysis of his novel, The Jewel of Seven Stars, in light of that kind of typical magical trope. She does note something which I think also connects this kind of imagery, connects this kind of spiritualist language, and connects, I suppose, the skepticism of the narrator, who's thinking about the sofa with the false back, to the kinds of performance that were going on in the Egyptian hall. So she notes that the leading Victorian illusionist John Neville Maskelyne, who established London's most famous magic theatre at the Egyptian Hall in 1873, commenced his career by reproducing the Davenport cabinet and staging it as illusion, science and seance, converged on the late Victorian stage. That final sentence being so fantastic, I wish I had written it myself. So again, we see how technologies, how apparatus facilitate the magical, the fake, but also quite possibly to some people who are witnessing this, the very much real. And I mean real not just in terms of something that they fully believe, but also something that you can ironically imagine to be real and to willingly participate in, and to have this double consciousness, to hark back to Michael Saylor. So I think we do see this language of performance, whether it's of the seance or the anti-spiritualist demonstration coming through in Iris. Of course, the magic, once again, is utterly real in the novel. We never have an instance of Egyptian magic in the text I'm talking about where the magic isn't real, where it is faked. And to turn now, you'll be pleased to hear, to the final example, and this is Mary Corelli's novel Ziska, first published in 1897. And at the climax of Ziska, we have what feels to me to be a kind of preempting those classic Georges Méliès fades in and out and those transitions between states. So this is the climax of the novel. This is a novel about an ancient Egyptian woman who back in the past has been murdered by her lover in this kind of intensely passionate, jealous moment. And she decides to exert her revenge. And as he is reincarnated in the modern world, in our late 19th century world for her original readers, Ziska is now a kind of ghostly figure who pursues him ultimately to murder him, as he has done her all those thousands of years ago. And the novel's climax happens in this kind of mysterious tomb space. And Gervais, who is this artist who is the reincarnation of Ziska's ancient Egyptian lover, is led down into this space and sees her there leaning against the great gold sarcophagus, her exquisite form scarcely concealed by the misty white of her draperies, her dark hair hanging like a cloud over her shoulders, and her black eyes aflame with wrath, menace, and passion. There stood mysterious Ziska. So we have her as very much that typically beautiful ancient Egyptian woman, although slightly angry. I'm not even going to say slightly here, exquisitely angry, let's describe her as. And I think from this moment where we see her, her dark hair, her black eyes, the misty white draperies, the classic Egyptian femme fatale figure, we get that eerie fade effect going on here in Corelli's novel. So as this climax progresses, Gervais gazed at her spellbound, his blood freezing, his very limbs stiffening, for now she looked like death. Death, livid, tortured and horrible, stared at him skull-wise from the transparent covering of her exquisitely tinted, seeming human flesh. That transparency, I think, is really telling. We get that fade effect, we almost get that double exposure effect of spirit photography coming through here. And it's just solidified, or perhaps the opposite of solidified, as things progress. So our narrator describes her form grew thin and skeleton-like. That imagery that we see in Melies definitely being preempted here, where we get the beautiful woman transforming into skeleton, while still retaining the transparent outline of its beauty. Again, that emphasis on transparency. And he realized at last that no creature of flesh and blood was this that clung to him, but some mysterious, bodiless horror of the supernatural. And I'm reminded of those moments in Melies where, because we're modern viewers and we're more attuned to these things, we can see those moments where the transparent becomes the opaque, and when the opaque becomes the transparent, and when the bodily becomes bodiless. And this novel certainly predates Melies's work, so I'm not trying to suggest that Corelli was influenced specifically by Melies, but I think if you look at the culture combined, if you look at the culture of spiritualist imagery, if you look at the Egyptian hall and the kinds of magic that was being performed there, and we see the kinds of influences that Melies was responding to, I think we can see some really interesting echoes going on in Corelli too. So to draw this to a conclusion, and this is the beginning of I want to say the beginning of a project. It's a project I've been thinking about for some time now, but a project that I'm only really getting to grips with recently. I think what interests me most of all about these encroachments of the modern magical, whether that's spiritualism or stage magic or those interesting, perhaps most interesting blurred spaces, is the way that ancient Egyptian magic and the ancient Egyptian supernatural is coded and couched in the language of modernity so often in each of these texts. And sometimes it's playful, as in Haggard and in Nesbit, but sometimes it's really serious, like in Iris and in Ziska. I don't think we're supposed to be recognizing modern illusory language or techniques in them and thinking, isn't this funny? So I think it's put to different uses, and I'm struck by the I suppose the consistency of how the ancient and the modern are brought together in those moments. We don't just get ancient Egyptian magic described in such terms that emphasizes just its ancientness, but there's also something cutting edge about it. And I wonder if that's for multiple reasons. I wonder if it's for the audiences to recognize something threatening and new in that. And I wonder also if there's something about the supremacy of ancient Egyptian magic that we're supposed to take away. Harking back to those books on conjuring and those books on the history of magic, which start with, you know, the birthplace of magic was ancient Egypt, or the pinnacle of magical achievement was in ancient Egypt. I wonder if what we're actually meant to take away from the collision of the modern with the ancient is that the ancient Egyptian power, the ancient Egyptian supernatural will always overpower the modern, that while the modern is detectable, there is something so overwhelmingly present and current about the ancient Egyptian that we cannot just pass it off and say, well, that was thousands of years ago and it has no impact on the modern world. I wonder if its very modernity suggests its continued kind of impact and influence on our own modern world. So I'm going to draw this to a close here, and I hope the questions aren't too difficult. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking to you all soon.